President Xi Jinping has promised to further open up China's vast markets to the outside world in an address to APEC leaders. The 28th Summit of Pacific Rim Economies is taking place virtually, hosted by New Zealand. Well, Hosuk Lee-Makiyama is director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, and he joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much indeed for being with us today. So, talk of further opening up from China's president, as well as of cooperation. What did you make of his remarks?
Well, Xi's speech was definitely interesting, and in many regards, I found it extremely reconciliatory, especially because China could have taken a much more defensive stance if you think about what kind of countries that are actually in APEC. You have, first of all, you have the current conflicts that no one has missed with Australia and United States. But also we need to bear in mind that in APEC, it's one of the very few international forums where Beijing and Taipei actually sit around at the same table. So it was quite impressive from that point of view that President Xi affirmed and supported common goals, including a very ambitious plan that New Zealand has launched and actually turned into an action plan around closer cooperation called the Putrajaya Vision, and also reaffirming many of the other points. And it also contained quite a few interesting nuggets that are linked to their host, Jacinda Ardern.
And usually APEC meetings focus on trade, but this year's, perhaps not surprisingly, have been dominated by climate change.
Well, I do dare to actually challenge you on that, because if you look at the deliverables, especially during the New Zealand chairmanship, you can see commitments to eliminate duties, for example, on medical goods to fight the pandemic. You have also, exactly as you're saying, it's a commitment to climate change. But if you really look into the details, there are quite interesting work that has been promoted by New Zealand, for example, on standardization or agreement on what kind of services could actually constitute environmental services that should be promoted by all the APEC countries. So yes, indeed, there are certain objectives, but the instrument or the tool of the trade, if I may say, is trade and economics.
And obviously the pandemic couldn't be ignored, could it? Are the regions at something of a crossroads after that? What are the major challenges it faces to bounce back?
Well, the economy is, of course, economy is one of the big questions, because certain countries, for example, like China, is almost or entirely out of the dark tunnel, and some people are still inside it. And here's where I think we have to really look at the fact that APEC is not a trade agreement. It doesn't actually liberalize trade, but what it does is that it makes sure that there is a ratchet to make sure that things don't get worse. We have to remember that APEC members are sovereigns, which means that they are free to undertake any domestic regulations or trade policy that they like, but actually agreeing and sitting around the table and say, we will stop from making things work for each other. And that's where APEC is a really interesting forum as a forum for international cooperation, where all recognize that they hang together.
Well, I wanted to get a bit more detail on that, actually. How valuable is it to have a forum like this with some big world players outside of something like the G20, where regional issues can take centre stage?
It's interesting you would say that, because G20 and APEC may operate kind of in a similar way, because it tends to be incubator for ideas, and also where things can be tested and before they're taken, for example, to a World Trade Organization, or sometimes in the sidelines of APEC and G20. Many of the issues are pre-negotiated, which we also see a couple of weeks ago at the G20 meeting. But one thing that actually differentiates APEC from G20, which is that all the members of G20 are neighbors. They depend on each other. Although I'm sure that the relationship between two G20 countries, like, let's say, Argentina and Turkey, is really, really impressive and intense. But you can really look at the APEC as a club of neighbors. And you don't have a Europe in the room. You don't have necessarily certain players who are Atlantic facing, or you don't have Africa. So which basically means that when they actually gather around APEC, they need to get along. And that's what's really impressive about this cooperation, where China has now been a member for 30 years. And President Xi was also very, he recognized the fact that APEC had been really important for China's development in this regard.
Hosuk Lee-Makiyama from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Thanks very much indeed.